My name is Anna, and I never thought my life would turn into such a painful tale of betrayal, torment, and finally, revenge. I was young when I married Daniel, a man I believed would protect me, stand by me, and build a home with me filled with love and peace. For the first few months after our marriage, I tried to convince myself that things were fine, that his temper was just temporary, that his drinking was something he would overcome, and that marriage was about patience and sacrifice. But I was wrong, terribly wrong. The mask he wore in the beginning fell off soon, and what I saw underneath was a cruel, selfish, and greedy man who cared for nothing but property, money, and his own ego. One night, when he came home drunk, swaying in the doorway, reeking of alcohol, his eyes bloodshot and wild, he shouted words that pierced me like knives. "Go to your father," he screamed, his voice echoing through the house. "Tell him to hand me his property, or else I'll give you divorce papers and throw you out of this house." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, trembling, my hands clutching my dupatta, my eyes filled with tears. I thought maybe I had heard wrong. Maybe the alcohol had spoken instead of the man, but he repeated it, louder this time, with anger and venom. "You heard me, Anna. Go to your father and tell him if he doesn't give me his property, I will throw you away like garbage. Do you understand?" I couldn't stop crying that night. My heart felt like it was being ripped apart. I loved my father too much to bring him such shameful demands. But I also feared what my husband might do. Finally, with heavy steps and a broken heart, I went to my father the next day and told him everything. He listened quietly, his eyes filled with pain, his hands trembling as he held mine. He was a strong man, my father, but in that moment, I saw him crumbling inside. "Anna," he said softly, his voice heavy with grief. "What kind of man have you married? I thought he would take care of you, protect you, and instead, he's using you to break me. Why, my daughter, why did God write such a fate for you?" His tears fell, and I felt my soul shatter into pieces. I begged him not to take Daniel's words seriously, but deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning of a long nightmare. From that day onward, life became unbearable. Daniel would come home drunk almost every night, his steps unsteady, his mouth spilling poison. He would grab me by the arm, push me against the wall, and shout the same thing again and again. "Tell your father to give me his property. Do it, Anna, or else you'll regret it." He slapped me, insulted me, humiliated me, and reduced me to nothing more than a punching bag for his frustration and greed. Each night felt longer than the last. Each morning filled me with dread. And slowly, I started losing myself. The girl who once dreamed of love and family became a shadow who lived in silence and fear. I wore long sleeves to hide the bruises. I avoided looking into the mirror because I could no longer recognize the woman staring back. And I prayed silently for a miracle that never came. But the worst pain was not my bruises or my tears. The worst pain was seeing my father suffer. Every time Daniel repeated his demand, every time he mocked me about property, every time I had to tell my father, it killed him inside. His shoulders became heavy, his eyes lost their light, and his smile disappeared. He grew weaker, not just in body, but in spirit. And I could see guilt written on his face as if he blamed himself for my suffering. That was unbearable for me. I wanted to protect him, but I couldn't. I wanted to stop Daniel, but I wasn't strong enough, at least not yet. The years dragged on. 7 years of torture, 7 years of insults, 7 years of being treated as nothing but a tool. Daniel never changed. If anything, he became worse. His drinking grew heavier, his violence sharper, his greed deeper. He sold whatever he could, wasted money, destroyed his own future, and still his eyes were always fixed on my father's property. But what he didn't realize was that during those years, something inside me was changing too. I was no longer the weak girl who cried quietly in the dark. Slowly, pain turned into strength. Silence turned into planning, and fear turned into rage. Deep in my heart, a fire was burning. I swore to myself that one day, I would make him pay for every tear, every insult, every bruise. I would not remain a victim forever. I would take my revenge. And then, after 7 long years, fate showed me the scene that I will never forget. I was walking near the bus station one afternoon when my eyes caught a figure sitting on the ground. Dirty, broken, with shabby clothes and hollow cheeks. At first, I didn't recognize him. But then he lifted his head, and my heart skipped a beat. It was Daniel, my husband, the man who once threatened me with divorce papers, who shouted for property, who tortured me for years, was now reduced to a beggar. His eyes no longer held arrogance, but shame. His hands, once raised to hit me, were now stretched out to strangers for coins. He had nothing left, no house, no money, no family. He was destroyed by the very greed that once made him powerful in his own eyes. And in that moment, I felt a strange calm inside me. My revenge was complete, not because I lifted a hand against him, but because life itself had punished him more than I ever could. That day, I walked away with my head held high. I didn't say a word to him. I didn't need to. His fall was louder than any words I could have spoken. And as I walked away, I whispered to myself, Anna, you survived. You endured. And in the end, you won. Asterisk. The years that followed were like walking barefoot on burning coals, each step filled with pain, but each step also teaching me endurance. I often asked myself why I stayed, why I didn't just run away from Daniel and never look back. But life is never that simple. My father, already weakened by the burden Daniel had placed on him, needed me near. And in some strange way, I wanted Daniel to believe he had me trapped, because I knew in my heart that one day, the trap would turn on him. He thought of me as a weak woman, one who would bow down forever under his demands. But what he didn't know was that I had started learning to use his weaknesses against him. Every time he came home drunk and shouted about property, I no longer cried in front of him. I stayed silent, nodding, pretending to be the same broken woman he believed I was. But in my silence, I was watching, observing, memorizing every mistake he made, every foolish gamble, every careless word he slurred. Daniel was a man who loved control, but his drinking robbed him of it night after night. He lost money to strangers, made enemies in gambling dens, and earned a reputation in the neighborhood as a violent drunk. People stopped respecting him, even those he called friends. They laughed behind his back, whispered about how pathetic he looked stumbling home late at night, and avoided dealing with him in business. But his pride was too blind to see any of it. He thought he was feared, but the truth was he was pitied. That truth gave me strength, because it meant that slowly, he was destroying himself. And all I had to do was wait for the pieces to fall apart. My father's health worsened during those years, and that was a pain no words could describe. Each visit to his house broke me further. Watching the man who had once been my rock become frail under the weight of stress. He would hold my hand, look into my eyes, and whisper, Anna, just endure a little longer. Life will not let him go unpunished. Those words became my shield. I held them close to my heart whenever Daniel raised his hand, whenever he shouted, whenever he threatened me. I clung to the belief that justice might be slow, but it was certain. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. The humiliation, the bruises, the endless demands for property, it was like poison dripping into my veins. But instead of letting it kill me, I let it harden me. I promised myself that if the chance ever came, I would not hesitate to watch him fall. I would not waste tears on him anymore. He had stolen enough of my soul. I wouldn't let him take what remained. And slowly, the world began to shift. Daniel's drinking turned into addiction, his addiction turned into recklessness, and his recklessness turned into downfall. He sold whatever little valuables he had, pawned things from the house without asking me, borrowed money from shady men he could never repay. I heard whispers in the neighborhood of people mocking him, calling him useless, saying he was living on borrowed time. He lost jobs, one after another, and every time he came home with anger in his eyes, he blamed me for his failures. If your father had given me the property, he would roar, my life would not have been like this. His voice echoed, but I no longer flinched. I no longer wept. I stood quietly, waiting, because I knew his time was running out. It was not easy to live through those days. Sometimes, when he stormed into the house drunk, I thought he might kill me in his rage. But I learned to protect myself not with violence, but with patience. I would step aside, let his anger burn itself out, and remind myself that every day, he sank deeper into the hole he dug with his own hands. And when I looked at him, I no longer saw the monster who frightened me. I saw a broken man pretending to be powerful, a coward hiding behind threats. That realization gave me courage. I even began to rebuild small pieces of myself. I found strength in small things, reading, helping my father with what little I could, spending time with neighbors who whispered kind words of encouragement. They didn't know the depth of my pain, but their kindness reminded me I was still human, not just a victim. And each act of kindness was another stitch mending the torn fabric of my soul. Then, one day, Daniel's downfall came crashing faster than I expected. He was caught in a fight at a local bar after refusing to pay his debts. He came home bruised and bleeding, cursing the world, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange calm, like watching a storm destroy itself. I looked at him, sitting on the floor, spitting blood, and I thought, this is only the beginning. 7 years had passed since that first night when he demanded my father's property. 7 years of torment, humiliation, and violence. And then fate handed me the sight I had dreamed of but never imagined I'd actually see. Daniel, sitting at a bus station, dressed in filthy, torn clothes, his hair unkempt, his face hollow. From years of drinking, his hands trembling as he begged strangers for coins. The man who once threatened to throw me out, who once thought himself mighty enough to destroy me and my father, was now nothing more than a beggar on the street. I stood at a distance, watching him. He didn't even recognize me. His eyes were too empty, his soul too broken. He was no longer Daniel the husband, Daniel the tormentor. He was just another lost man, swallowed by his own greed and sins. And in that moment, I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt justice. This was my revenge, not with blood, not with violence, but with patience. I had waited for life to strip him of everything he thought mattered, and life did not disappoint. When I saw him sitting at that bus station, begging, I felt as if the earth had finally shifted in my favor after years of turning against me. For a long time, I just stood there, half hidden behind a pillar, staring at him while countless memories rushed through my mind. I remembered his booming voice, drunk and furious, shouting at me to go to my father and demand property. I remembered the countless nights when his hands struck my face, when he pushed me against the wall, when he threatened me with divorce like it was a curse he could cast whenever he pleased. I remembered my father's pale face when I told him, Daniel's demands, the guilt in his eyes, the helplessness in his trembling voice. All of those moments came back, sharp and painful. But instead of breaking me this time, they fueled a sense of triumph inside me. Daniel sat on the ground, his clothes ripped, his beard unkempt, his once proud eyes now dull with defeat. His hands stretched out to strangers who barely looked at him, and I could see how low he had fallen. I thought back to the man who demanded property, who wanted to own what was never his, who believed he could build his life on the misery of others. And now he couldn't even own his own dignity. He had traded everything for alcohol, arrogance, and greed, and in the end, he was left with nothing. I walked closer, my footsteps steady. Part of me wanted to stand in front of him, to look him in the eye and say, "Do you remember me? Do you remember the woman you called worthless? The woman you beat and humiliated?" I wanted to remind him of every word he had thrown at me like knives, of every tear he had caused me and my father. But when I reached a few steps away, I realized I didn't need to say a thing. His condition spoke louder than my words ever could. His downfall was my answer. His misery was my revenge. He looked up at me for just a second, his eyes searching my face, but there was no recognition. The man who once demanded everything from me couldn't even recognize the woman who had endured his cruelty for 7 long years. That, too, was a kind of justice. He had erased me from his respect, from his heart, from his life, and now fate had erased him from mine. I turned away, not because I was afraid, but because I had already won. As I walked away from that bus station, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. I thought of my father, who had left this world with the pain of my marriage heavy on his chest, and I wished he could have seen this moment. He had once told me that life would not let Daniel go unpunished, and he had been right. Life had its own way of bringing justice, and though it took years, it delivered more harshly than I ever could have imagined. I did not raise a hand against him. I did not plot to ruin him, but still, he was ruined. That was the power of patience, the strength of endurance. My silence had been my weapon, my pain had been my shield, and my survival had been my greatest victory. I had outlived his cruelty, and in the end, he had been destroyed by his own greed. That night, I sat by my window, staring at the stars, and for the first time in years, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness, it was a smile of peace. The kind of peace that comes only when you know that justice has been served, when you know that your suffering has not been in vain. My story was no longer just one of pain. It had become a story of survival, of resilience, and of revenge delivered by the very hands of fate. And so, when people ask me why I endured so much, why I stayed silent, why I didn't fight back sooner, I tell them this. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not in what you do, but in what life does for you. Sometimes, all you need to do is wait, endure, and let time unravel the truth. Daniel thought he had broken me, but in reality, he had forged me into something stronger than he could ever imagine. And while he begged on the streets in shabby clothes, I stood tall, proud, and free, knowing that the marriage that once felt like a prison had ended with my ultimate victory. This is my story, the story of Anna, the story of how a broken wife became a survivor, how silence turned into strength, and how patience turned into the sweetest revenge.